This happened in 2011. Back then I was very engaged in political activism, and I ended up organizing an Occupy movement in the city I was living in, along with some other fellows. We camped in a downtown square for about 4 months, and throughout this period a lot of people came in and out. By the second month I had to travel to another city where my parents were living for a week. When I came back to the occupation, there was a guy living there that had arrived exactly when I had left. He had somehow already had some respect from other people in a very short period of time. He was tall, blonde, long hair, a bit hippie, had a profound voice that implied self-confidence. He had by some means a strange aura. But okay, no big deal, seemed like a cool guy after a while. Over time he became my friend, and we ended up having long conversations about pretty much everything that interested me and vice versa, like occultism, magic, UFOs, etc., until he brought up the vampirism subject, which I was not familiar with at the time. He explained to me some stuff like that vampires were basically normal people that could manage their own life force, and apparently they have been misinterpreted since always. He told me that there were some secret vampire groups, small ones, that preserved the rituals. There was no blood-sucking thing going on, as he said that blood was an analogy to life force. They were not actually sucking it from people, but they could indeed take somebody's life force. But more important, he said, was to know how to use your own. The conversation finished there. The whole thing seemed fascinating to me, and after a while, we went to sleep. Some days later, here's what happened. My house was quite close to the occupation, and once in a while some of my friends would often ask me to use the bathroom or to have a shower, and then this guy asked me the same. I said yes, no problem at all. Everything went fine, the guy had his shower, and we were walking back to the occupation, and he brought up the subject about vampirism again. This time he was wearing an anonymous plastic mask, which completely covered his face. He starts to explain to me how one can control their own life force inside dreams, and how would that affect the actual material body. Meanwhile, as he's explaining that, I see his jaw making a strange movement, as if there was something stuck between his teeth, and he was trying to clean it. When he finishes the explanation, he calls me by my name and raises the mask slightly so I can take a look at his mouth. And then I saw this huge canine tooth. He pulled the mask back down quickly. I didn't know how to react, so I just remained calm and I asked him what was that for if they didn't actually suck blood from other people. He told me that it worked out as a sort of antenna to capture different vibrations, and he managed to construct it by molding his life force into that shape inside his dreams. He asked me if I would be interested in doing the same. I told him that it sounded interesting, and he just left me to think about it. We arrived at the occupation as if nothing had happened. I didn't see any strange movements by his hands trying to insert a fake tooth into his mouth, or trying to remove it after. The sensation I got was that he pulled the tooth out by a jaw movement. The whole thing was just very strange to digest. I had no idea what to do, so I called my friend and he just said that the whole story sounded too crazy to be believable. We still lived together in the occupation for a while, but I never brought up the subject again. The guide totally noticed my attempt to avoid it, so he didn't push me on it either. There was another strange fact after a while. Once he was shirtless, and crouched organizing some stuff inside of his tent, and the muscles on his back formed into the shape of a winged dragon. The occupation eventually finished, and that guy ended up dating a girl that he met there, and they both had a kid together. He seemed pretty normal, despite those 2 occasions. I work in a hospital that's run by the Sisters of a Catholic convent. This hospital is pretty old, set almost in the early 1910s. Needless to say, quite a few buildings on the campus are ancient and eerie. No feet. I had night duty a few days back, and since there weren't any patients to attend to, I went to sleep in the room assigned to me in the emergency room itself. A few minutes in, I felt extremely cold. It was the peak of summer, and this coolness just didn't feel right. I got up, switched on the lights, and went out, calling the nursing staff. I told them I didn't feel comfortable sleeping in there tonight. They were more than happy to entertain me for the rest of the evening. One of the staff is a dear friend, and she asked if I wanted to hear a ghost story. I jumped in because now we were a crowd, and there was no reason to be afraid. She told me about this incident in the baby ward. It was the middle of the night. A mother walked up to the nurse's station requesting for a bowl to feed her child. One of the nurses noted down the details, mother's and baby's name, and handed over the bowl. A few seconds later, the same nurse happened to look back and saw that the woman had no feet and was floating away in the air. She pointed to the other sister as well. After recovering from what they had seen, the nurse fired up the system to check the patient's name, and to their surprise, the discharge summary by the baby and mother's name showed up. The mother had died of postpartum hemorrhage after delivering a premature baby, and the baby too had passed away a few days later due to some neonatal infection. C floor. This floor consists of private wards and is pretty posh. There's a call switch for each ward which the patient rings in case they need something, and the bell sounds in the nurse's station. One of my usual nightly duties, I was typing a discharge summary when the bell to Ward 7 rang. The nurses were on break and seemed to not hear it. My senior asked me to go check on it in case it was our patient. I got up and walked through the dark corridor in search of room 7, which was at the end of the hallway. The lights were off, and it seemed like whoever was inside was sleeping. I knocked, but nobody responded. A strange sense of fear crept through me. I ran. I reached the nurse's station. My senior looked up to see me breathing heavily. He asked if I was all right. I told him that the room was dark and that no one opened the door when I knocked. The nurses walked in at the same time and told me that there was no one admitted in Ward 7 and that the bell often rang like that. They wouldn't react unless someone was admitted. SICU bed number 1. The curious case about this bed is that no matter who ends up on it, eventually dies, no matter how young or healthy that the patient is. The incidents have been pretty unnatural over the past few months, and there's no scientific explanation. Just a few days back, a 22-year-old boy was admitted for gallbladder surgery, was shifted to SICU after surgery, and a few hours after shifting, he developed breathlessness and died before intubation. Doctors usually do not like their patients to be assigned to this bed. Even if the SICU is full, as soon as a bed vacates, a patient from number 1 immediately gets assigned a number 2 bed. There's no backstory about this. At least, not that I'm aware of. This happened to me when I was in high school. I was at my friend's house at the time, who lived in an apartment building. She had a neighbor who lived upstairs, and was a few years younger than us, who we hung out with when I visited my friend's apartment. On this specific day, my friend's neighbor mentioned that she had a Ouija board, and asked if we wanted to use it with her. We both agreed, as I personally didn't think Ouija boards were actually paranormal, and thought it was a myth. We went into a garage area of the apartment building and put our fingers on the planchette. For the first few hours, nothing really even happened. Eventually, we had movement on the planchette and started asking questions to this spirit, who would answer us. I forgot who, but someone asked if the spirit was trying to communicate with anyone. Interestingly enough, it spelled out my name. I was skeptical and thought it was one of my friends messing with me, so I asked what its name was. It then spelled out my grandmother's name, who died 6 months before this Ouija board encounter. I started getting a little uncomfortable, as my grandmother's name is in another language, and my friends did not know this language, nor have I ever told them what her name was. They wouldn't even know how to spell it either. Weirded out, I asked what my grandmother wanted. She started spelling out U-R-G-R, and then the planchette started going in weird circles, and even going off of the board, and wasn't spelling out anything that made sense. So I asked for further clarification, and then just "You are great" popped up. This will be important later, so keep that in mind. Anyway, at that point I thought it was just one of us moving it weirdly, so I said goodbye. A few days later, my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, suddenly passed away. It was unexpected, as he was in great health, and it was right before Christmas, and he was so excited for Christmas. As I was at his funeral, I remembered sitting there and thinking about the Ouija board, and that's when it hit me. When my grandmother initially tried to spell out something that started with G-R, I realized that grandfather starts with G-R. But then the planchette had moved around so weirdly when my grandmother couldn't spell out the rest of the word, as if something had been stopping my grandmother from completing the word and warning me. The next few months were hell, as I started blaming myself, and was convinced that I had somehow contributed to my grandfather's death by using this board. It got to the point that I became suicidal, and the scariest part is, my thoughts felt as if they were not my own. As if something were trying to lead me toward taking my life, as they were very dark. I can't explain it, as it could have been guilt, but I felt like something was watching me all the time and felt a strange presence in the next few months after using the board. There's also the fact that the night of when I used the Ouija board, I was in the bathroom and I was underneath some lights. I had a strange sensation and felt that I needed to walk away, but right when I did, the lights shattered and would have injured me if I had been standing underneath. I eventually confessed to my mother about the Ouija board experience, and right when I did, I felt a giant weight lift off of my shoulders. The negative and dark thoughts were slowly disappearing, and I started to not feel the dark presence anymore when I overcame these thoughts. However, I was still wondering if the spirit that I had contacted was even really my grandmother. I also wondered if I was imagining this dark presence and the dark thoughts that I had had. Fast forward, I was at an overnight event at my school and another friend brought a Ouija board. I decided to use it one more time with this friend and try to get some answers. At one point, the Ouija board said that it was trying to contact me specifically. When we asked who it was, it then started spelling out D-E-V. We started panicking, but then it spelled out to a word that I forgot. I dismissed it and thought it was nothing, but my friend decided to look up the word. A few weeks later, she told me that the word meant devil in another language. It was then confirmed to me that it may not have been my grandmother who was contacting me the first time. There's also the fact that there may have been something that was trying to get to me and did not have good intentions. To this day, I am convinced that this spirit only tried to warn me about my grandfather so that when he passed, I would have felt guilty. By feeling guilty, I was more vulnerable to the spirit's influences, to the point that I would almost take my own life. I do not know if this is what actually happened, but it's the only logical explanation that I have. About 2 years ago, my Nana brought home a Ouija board that she found at a yard sale. I have always been a true believer in the paranormal, and it's always been one of my peak interests. I have heard or read enough stories and watched enough shows to know not to mess around with a Ouija board, and quite frankly, they kind of freaked me out, so I wanted nothing to do with it. My Nana, on the other hand, doesn't believe in the paranormal whatsoever, and thought it would just be a fun game for myself, my brother, and the oldest of my 2 cousins. I left it on the dining room table for days before she made me put it away. I ended up sliding it under my bed in hopes of just forgetting about it. My brother, 11, and my cousin, 12, bugged me about it constantly because they wanted to play with it and I wouldn't let them. I tried to explain to them that it wasn't just a game and that it shouldn't be messed with, but they were preteen boys who couldn't help but do things that they shouldn't. One day after I got home from work, the boys were there and I had this sneaking suspicion that they played with it. I looked under my bed and it was there, but I just had this odd feeling. That's when I went downstairs and interrogated them about it. At first, of course, they denied it, but I saw right through them until they finally admitted that they had in fact played with the board. I asked them if they had said goodbye when they were done, and they claimed that they did. My cousin likes to over-exaggerate stories big time, and makes things up to be overly dramatic, so when he told me about a couple of things that supposedly happened, I didn't believe him at all. Also, they were boys who liked to mess with each other, so I assumed that's what was occurring. Anyways, a couple of nights later I got in bed, and as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I got this feeling like I was being watched. I looked over at my closet, which has 2 sliding doors, and I noticed one of the doors is slightly opened, leaving a small space. It creeped me out for some reason, so I turned and faced the other way, trying to ignore everything and just fall asleep. I finally passed out, and the next thing I know I'm woken up by what felt like someone or something hitting me in the back of the head. I was lying on my back, so the back of my head was fully on my pillow, which made it even weirder. And it wasn't a light hit either. It scared me so bad. I was shaking. I look around my room and I don't see anything, but then all of a sudden I hear my floor creaking like someone is walking around my bed. After laying there for a good little while, I finally got the courage to get up and grab my phone and book it to my living room. I sat and tried to calm down. I could still feel a tingling, pulsating sensation at the back of my head. I turned on my phone and realized it was 3 in the morning. I called my boyfriend, now husband, with tears streaming down my face from being so freaked out. He didn't pick up, and I swear I called him another 15 to 20 times before I finally gave up. I sat in the chair until my Nana got up around 6. I didn't tell her what had happened, because I knew she wouldn't believe me and would say I was acting stupid. After she got up, I had breakfast and then called my boyfriend again, and he finally answered. He told me he had his phone on silent mode so that he didn't know that I had been calling. I gave him so much crap for this, let me tell you. I told him what had happened and he felt so bad and felt like an idiot. He told me he would have come over in a heartbeat to comfort me and was so apologetic. Later that day, he came over and we took the Ouija board to a junkyard to get rid of it. My husband is the only one in my family that knows what happened, and I didn't experience anything again after I got rid of the Ouija board. So once again, moral of the story, Ouija boards should not be messed with. I lived in Adams, Tennessee growing up, from about the ages of 14 to 18. A couple of weeks after my family and I moved there, something unexpected happened. I was mowing on my dad's tractor with a big 8-foot wide back-end mower. I was going down a hill when my horizon line violently was thrown around as the tractor tires hit something. I disengaged the mower, pulled the tractor around at the base of hill that I had just gone down. My blood went cold as I looked up through the swath I had just cut, like a buzzer going down the middle of someone's head making a lane for the grass. In that lane were 4 Native American burial sites. My parents started reaching out to anyone who might be able to help us identify the graves. Anthropologists, historians, accredited people, etc. Those people unanimously agreed that these 4 graves were from the Trail of Tears. They corroborated this from what I remember because of how the graves were laid, very, very shallow, with a giant slab of stone where a gravestone would normally be. The fact that they were interned on a hillside to keep the water from sinking in and raising the bodies since they had to bury them so quickly, and many other reasons. I consider myself a very logically driven and rationally minded person. Basically, I let my empirical senses try to explain something before I'll open myself to other possibilities. Yet, there were things that happened to me and my whole family that we weren't able to rationalize with the scientific mindset, or with anything logical. Event 1 occurred when the activity in our house started shortly after the mowing incident. We heard heavy knocking and pounding on the brick outer wall of the house encircling the house. No matter where you were in the house, you could hear that sound. Some nights I would hear running footsteps accompanying the pounding. This activity happened nearly every single night. As the nights passed, I started feeling a heavy presence in my room. A suffocating one, like a heavy weight sitting on my solar plexus constantly. Whatever was happening decided to latch onto my sister and I. She reported tightness in her chest too, and would wake up violently screaming from scratch marks and pieces of her hair that had been pulled out. The scratches started happening to me as well. Event 2 is that things continued to escalate. One night I was letting my golden retriever go out to use the bathroom. We had a ranch-style house overlooking the Red River. The door we were exiting was on the back side of the house facing the water. As I open the door, I start hearing faint whispering, something akin to leaves being blown or scratching across the ground. I looked up at the trees to see if the wind was blowing, but everything was perfectly still. It was fall in Tennessee, so there were tons of leaves on the ground, and they were not moving either. The scratchy/blowing leaf noise continued, but as it continued, it grew closer and louder. It sounded like a language of some sort, like how you'd imagine an incantation or something nefarious in the tone of the sound. I looked down at my golden retriever. All of the hair on her back was standing up, and she was snarling like a rabid wolf, yet not barking, just kind of frozen in some sort of fear response. I started getting extremely nauseous and could smell sulfur. I was completely frozen when my dog launched herself through the door's threshold and started gnashing her teeth mid-air while snarling and chomping. The voices were now coming from directly in front of me. I could hear them as if someone were standing there just a foot or two away. I grab my dog and pull her quickly inside, slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt into place. The door and frame shook violently as a vicious pounding started hammering on the threshold. I ran with my dog to the middle of the house, flipping on every light along the way. We sat there alone all night until the sun came up. My parents were out of town supporting my sister in a competition. Ginger, my golden retriever, laid across my lap the entire night, pressing into me while she whimpered for hours. All I could do was pet her and try to calm her down, which was also helping me. This was impossible, though, completely. The entire night until sunrise, the back door was thumping. Event 3 happened when I was coming home from football practice. I had all my gear in a gym bag over my left shoulder. This is important because of how I entered the house. As I closed the front door behind me, I began sitting down the gear bag from my left side, which caused me to look right. The room when you first walked in was our quote-unquote library, where we had a leather couch, chair, piano, bookshelves, and a wooden rocking chair. There was something sitting in the rocking chair. My peripheral vision caught it first, the chair just going back and forth. As my vision centered on the chair, there was a humanoid-looking shape, head glancing downward at the book that it was holding. It had long black hair drawn down over its head and completely void of light. To picture what I saw, imagine the silhouette of a person in 3D form. The light coming in and around the edges of it seemed to be eaten up by the presence or void, as if the light spilled over the contour edges of the humanoid shape, like how black holes are visualized, almost exactly. It felt like I had jumped off of a bridge into ice-cold water. I blasted myself backward against the door, screaming, and fell down. As I was falling, I saw the void blur suddenly as it shot across the walls of the house and out through a huge bay window overlooking the river. My golden retriever was in the next room, and she came running to chase the shadow across the walls, barking and clawing at the plaster. After it left through the window, my dog came to see me and laid on my lap until my parents got home. Event 4 occurred while I was fishing with my cousin Jack on the river by our house. We were right on the bend of the river, so the moon would be shining through on both sides, racing out at 2 lines like a 90-degree angle from the house. Super beautiful when you weren't on edge. The reason I bring this up is because there was a lot of light on the river that evening. Jack was about 10 or so at the time. He reaches up and taps me and says, "Does that lady need help?" I looked to where he was pointing, and there was a pale woman dressed in white clothes going back and forth picking up stones just to the left of us across the river. I had seen her many times before around the property, and whenever I would get close, she would disappear behind a tree or something. Knowing this, I told Jack as calmly as I could that it was time for dinner and that he needed to go up to my mom immediately. When I walked him up and made sure that he was on his way, I looked back and she was gone, but I could hear a splashing sound in the water below. When Event 5 occurred, it was myself, my dad, his friends, and some other family members who were staked out along the river bend on the gravel bar beneath the rise to our house. As usual, nothing out of the ordinary happened at first. It was July 4th, and we were actually having a really good time for a change. We were all spread out about 15 yards away from each other. Each man had a low-end gas Coleman lantern. As the sun was setting, my dad looked over at me like something was bothering him. He told me later that he felt as if someone had just thrown a bucket of ice water over him before it began. The sun had just gone down when this happened. In unison, all the lanterns were cranked up full blast, then just as quickly became barely aflame. And then the flames roared to life again, down to barely a flame, roared to life, and then they went completely out. Right as the flames went out, we heard the most God-forsaken scream by some woman across the river. Whatever it was kept on screaming despite our best attempts to call out to help. As her scream reached a crescendo, it sounded like what I could only imagine as a person's throat being cut interrupted her. The sound of a dead weight fall of a human body tumbled down the hillside across from us and splashed violently into the water. At this point, all the guys had their flashlights out. That's when something started swimming and splashing around in the water on both sides of the river bend. The splashing receded toward the opposite gravel bar, and whatever it was got out and started pacing back and forth across the rocks there. We were pointing all of our flashlights to where the sound was coming from, but we couldn't identify where it was originating. It's safe to say we were all running up the hill at this point. We all went inside the house, locked the doors, then gathered in the central living room. Nobody wanted to leave for fear of what might be out there. We stayed up all that night because the wall pounding was more violent than it had ever been. Bam, 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 all night like the ticking of some demonic clock. I didn't sleep for 2 days after this event. Event 6 came in the form of lost time. I was walking through the woods near the Bell Witch Cave. One moment it was completely sunny, blue skies, and about mid-afternoon. The next moment it was overcast, and looked like it was maybe 4 p.m. I still have no idea what happened there. Event 7 was night terrors. Torture dreams, being held down and brutally drawn and quartered. Dreams of walking through the house and the void person placing their hand on my chest and pushing through my solar plexus, body violently shaking in the dream as if I were having a seizure. Event 8 happened as I visited the Bell House plantation marker in a tobacco field adjacent to my family's property. I brought friends to try and prove that something crazy was happening to my family. The rite of passage in the area is to go to the stone marker where the paranormal events happened hundreds of years ago, then dance on the stones saying, "I don't believe in the Bell Witch." I got them to promise they wouldn't do that while we went. Of course, the moment when we got there, one guy who doubted the legends in a massive way jumps up onto the stone marker and starts screaming, "I don't believe in the Bell Witch," as loud as he could. I got so upset at him. I'm the only one that knows the way back, so I said, "Come on guys, we're leaving." In this area, it's known as the Tennessee River Valley, so there's tons of flowing water, etc. around these tobacco fields. The reason this is important is because of what happened next. We're making good time walking back across this crop field, hundreds of yards long. A mist starts rolling in from the river bends and begins to saturate the field. The temperature drops easily 25 degrees or so, and we start to see our breath. I begin to smell sulfur in the breeze. As the mist became a fog, it began. I started hearing this wheezy and deeply cavernous sounding breath all around us, like being inside a cave that was breathing. Out of nowhere, we started hearing these giant blasting sounds, and I realized something was walking on the chopped tobacco stalks. Side note, when they harvest tobacco, they use a machete and cut down at a 45-degree angle, leaving about 3.5 feet of brittle stalk poking out of the ground. When you step on said stalks, they disintegrate in a very loud way as they burst apart. This starts happening all around us, like an army of native spirits running around us like a bandwagon battle. The blasts were coming from every single direction in the fog. That's when I hear it. The deep cavernous noise turns into this giant sniffing sound, like some Lovecraftian beast smelling its prey just out of sight. At this point, I yell "run" in pure panic mode. We take off across the field, trying not to trip and be skewered on the stalks. As we are exiting the field and our feet hit the gravel road, my lower center part of my back suddenly explodes in agony. I look down, and there's a massive rock lying at my feet, and I realized that I had just been assaulted. By the time I got to my house and examined my back in a mirror, the bruise was about the size of a basketball and was already turning black. And now for event 9. I woke up outside at about 3 in the morning. I was lying next to the 4 gravestones on the property. The night was awfully cold, but when I woke up, I was soaked in sweat. I grew up in a haunted house. Rather, a haunted neighborhood. It's an old Air Force base that has since been recommissioned for college students and families that go to school on the outskirts of town. Growing up there, I have experienced many strange things, most of which I cannot explain besides it being paranormal. Even though I know a good bit about the paranormal or the occult, some of these entities proved out of my knowledge base. I've seen my little sister's double, seen multiple shadows in the house with a friend present, had things move around, knocks on doors when no one else was home or asleep, footsteps up and down the hallway, conversations that would mute when you got close to them, and so many other occurrences. However, one of the creepiest ones always happened at the main bathroom. It had a small hallway branching from the main hallway. It wasn't very long, but I never felt safe there. During the night, even as a growing adult, I would run as fast as I could because I feared what was behind me. I slowly stopped doing so because I realized that whatever it was got some kind of sick pleasure from it. It slowly started to not feel like there was a presence nearby as much, but was still there. One evening, as I'm taking a shower getting ready for bed, I hear a knock, but not from the door. It came from the medicine cabinet, so being the curious person that I am, I peeled back the shower curtain to see some of the fog having been wiped off of the mirror. I started to take a closer look when I saw a black, slanted eye with no skin around it start to peek its way into my line of sight. I quickly hopped back into the shower and sat there back against the wall, not knowing what to do. I eventually turned the shower off and hauled ass out of there, still dripping wet. The next time I saw this thing, I was walking down the hall after getting home from school, and I'm the only one home. So I start to do what male teenagers do when no one was around. I hear some scuffling like dogs running around, and a door open. I ready myself for someone to be home, and as I walk out of my bedroom door, I hear a, "Hey," but muted and not a voice that I knew. So I start making my way toward the front door with my back to the wall, as I felt I might need to dash back to my room for safety. My mistake here was that I was facing the hallway that leads to the bathroom. I move over bit by bit, and I hear another voice, one that seems to be coming from the living room, so I take another step. Then I see something in the corner of my eye, like a hand pulling back from a corner. I couldn't make it out at the time, but it didn't freak me out enough until I got into full view of the hallway with this thing standing there in a grotesque way. Black slanted eyes, no skin anywhere, black claws, and smelled something awful, more of rotting meat than rotting eggs. I froze for a second before I saw it flinch, a little like it was coming for me, and I dashed back to my room, slamming the door behind me, only to get 3 knocks every few seconds. I don't remember what I said, but it was something along the lines of, "I'm not going to be afraid of you, you can't get past this door." And then it stopped. I waited there until someone got home, to which I went outside for the rest of the day, making sure I didn't have to use the restroom at night for any reason. A few months go by, and I'm still uncomfortable with this bathroom and the hallway, but not as much has happened since, so my guard starts to slip. One night, I believe it was a Friday night, I was taking a late night shower. Everything was going as normal, wash my hair, face, body, when suddenly the lights go out. There was a storm going on in town, and we were getting the weak part of it, so I didn't really think anything about the lights. I stepped out to turn on the lights and see if the house actually had power. Sure enough, the house did have power, but the bathroom wasn't turning on, yet the exhaust fan was still on. That's when I started to get really worried and turned the lights on one more time, and with no avail, and decided to keep my shower going in the dark. As I got back into the shower, I could feel something breathing on me, on the back of my neck, my shoulders. I felt a few brushes of what I hoped was just my towel and not something else. As I'm getting out of the shower, I'm drying my hair off, and the lights come back on. Awesome, I'm thinking as I start to dry my face. When I pull the towel off, I look up and the mirror once again doesn't have fog, but the whole lot of it, not just one part. I looked up a little more and just saw the thing there, right behind me, making a smile of sorts, but its mouth was sewn shut, or so it appeared. I stood there for about 5 seconds, unable to move, before slowly feeling its claw on my shoulder close to my neck. Suddenly I became unparalyzed and again left the bathroom dripping wet, running to my bedroom door. I slam it shut, shaken and trying to gather my nerves. I hear a deep, yet simultaneously high-pitched sort of laughter, and then I heard the bathroom door close. I went to bed that night with the lights on, all the while hearing more footsteps than usual in the hallway. I've seen the thing twice more, but thankfully those experiences were nowhere near as scary as the one mentioned above, since I've learned to deal with it and how to protect myself. I haven't heard much of skinless humanoids, so this is one thing that has always stuck with me. While I was growing up, around the age of 3 until 6 or 7, I had an invisible friend. He would only show up every once in a while. I thought maybe he was lonely and also needed a friend. I disliked the feeling of someone not having a friend when I was little, so I gently worked hard to be his friend. just so that he would have someone. Usually he would appear whenever my stepmom would be mean to us, and we were left alone for a bit afterward, or when I was scared or was having a paranormal experience which at the time I didn't understand. My teacher was fond of me and told my dad that I was special and could grow into either a very bad or a very good person. While the other kids would play on the playground together, I would sit on the hill and just enjoy the grass and trees and wind, and my teacher would sit down next to me, enjoying it in silence as well. I remember one time the other kids were on the playground and, without being told to, stopped playing and sat down with us, and we all just sat on the hill enjoying the breeze. It was a pretty nice memory, just all of us enjoying the silence and having a moment, until the school bell rang. My dad didn't think that the little boy was fake, while my stepmom tried to get me to see a specialist. My dad did eventually take me to a specialist in order to make my stepmom happy because they constantly argued about it. I remember that at our last appointment I was in the waiting room. My dad opened the door and went into her office, and I remember as my dad's back was turned to me that the specialist concluded that nothing was wrong with me, that I was just a normal kid. My dad said something along the lines of, "I thought so, thank you," and he took me out for ice cream afterward. My dad later opened up to me after his divorce and said that in every generation some of the kids have gifts and that some people don't like what they can't understand, and that's why he thought my old friend wasn't made up. To this day, I don't know if he was a ghost or an invisible friend I made up as a little girl, but I do remember that he had his own personality that I was not in control of. He never really talked about anything, like about his life, even if I asked him questions. He just wanted to play, or he would show up and say, "It's going to be okay." I remember after a while, as my stepmom hated it more and more, he sort of slowly went away. Sometimes I would call out for him, which I didn't do before, and he wouldn't show up. Sometimes when I would cry, I would sort of wait for him, hoping a little bit that he would show up. But he never did. I eventually forgot about the little boy until one day in middle school. It felt like something which was not very good was in my bedroom with me that night. The house was oddly quiet. I figured I was being silly, so I fell asleep. That night, I had a dream that I was inside of a broken-down city as a girl again. It was a misty night with puddles on the road. I could even feel the rain falling lightly on my skin. I remember that my hair was wet. The city seemed to be empty. The street lights looked old, and there weren't any lights on anywhere. Many of the building's windows were broken. Inside of the rooms were dusty and unkept. I also noticed that there wasn't any furniture inside of them or lights or doors. It was just rooms. I called out, and my voice kind of echoed as the rain tapped the ground. I noticed rather quickly that I wasn't alone. Something heard me. As a figure of something slowly crept in the distance on the street behind me, I looked closer, but it wasn't a person. I heard a loud screech, and I instantly started to run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Whatever was inhabiting that city wasn't expecting me. Suddenly, I was being chased by a bunch of shadowy, semi-human-looking things. They ran fast and would jump from the wall of one building to another building, clinging onto the sides, the bricks falling and hitting the streets and the sidewalks behind me. They nearly caught up to me until I turned the corner and started to run over to an old wooden fence on the outskirts of the city. I felt the water on the grass, and I think I slipped at least once. I saw the little boy on the other side of the dark brown, worn-down fence, and he said, "Take my hand." I did, and as we ran away through an open field in an attempt to reach some woods on the other side, those things were moments away from catching us. Their claws dug into the ground. Some of the speckles of dirt flew past my face. Then I woke up. On my ceiling above my bed, there was a huge man in armor and medium-length brown hair. His hair moved and little parts of his clothes moved with it, as if they were submerged. But it didn't look to me like he had been near water. He had a silk cloth. It was either red or purple. The only way I remember it is because part of it had floated steady near his hair and face. Light seemed to emit not only from his body but from underneath his skin as well. As I looked at his face, he had an expression of warmth and calm, and it felt like we knew each other. He seemed so familiar. Only the area from the top of his head until about his waist or a little below it could fit within the space of my ceiling. I remember his eyes. It was like he were trying to tell me something, that he was the little boy the entire time, and it was going to be okay. The only way that I can describe the feeling of familiarity I had is, you know the feeling when you see someone after a while and you realize you knew each other when you were kids? Eventually, after what felt like a longer time than what it probably was, the man faded away, and it was just me in my empty room. That morning when I went upstairs to fix myself some breakfast, my uncle was talking in the living room about having a dream. I didn't really catch what his dream was about, though, until he mentioned that he woke up in the middle of the night when he heard aggressive scratching and banging on his door. My dad didn't believe him, so he brought my dad and my sister and I downstairs to show us that it was true, to show my dad that he wasn't making it up. There were long, deep scratches on the other side of his bedroom door from the hallway. I can't explain what happened or what had made those scratch marks. I usually don't open up about my experiences. I honestly haven't had the courage to until a few days ago. Rarely have I shared them. I still haven't told my family about my dream, or the man I had seen either, but they still talk about the scratches. I'll let you decide whether or not she was really a vampire. Either way, I promise that this is a true story. It happened around December 2017. I had just finished high school, and one of my friends was hosting a house party. It was out in the country, large property, lovely view. It was a great place to celebrate the end of exams. I recognized a lot of people there and knew them quite well. However, there were two guests I didn't recognize, a boy and a girl. He was a stoic character with a solid build, not quite muscle, not quite fat, not quite someone that you would want to annoy. She was a thin figure with long amber hair and fair skin. He would scan the crowds while she shyly cradled a bottle. No one else was paying any attention to them, and I could tell they felt uncomfortable. They seemed nice enough, so I grabbed a friend and walked over to them, hoping that I could put them at ease. My friend left pretty quickly, but the girl seemed relieved that I was paying attention to them. She told me her name was Verity. Bit of an unusual name, but I thought it was pretty. Her boyfriend seemed a bit more comfortable too, but he didn't say much. I don't recall his name. Verity and I chatted for a while, but I was quickly running out of small talk. I asked her about the alcohol she was drinking and what kind she prefers, that sort of thing. She replied casually, it's okay, but my favorite substance is blood. I think that's a good cue to run away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I asked her why she enjoyed the taste of blood. I've cut my lip before, and I remember the taste being quite sour. She told me that the flavor is dependent on a person's health. The healthier they are, the sweeter their blood. It suddenly made sense as to why her boyfriend was built like an athlete. She taught me a few weird things about hematology, and was very knowledgeable about medieval execution methods. She explained them with a strange fondness. It was almost nostalgia. I only knew the Viking blood eagle, but that was enough to get her excited. We ended up talking all night. I listened to her gore-filled lectures, and they both listened to me as well. Even though my interests in stories were much less interesting in comparison, they didn't seem to mind. They smiled and encouraged me. In between subjects, Verity would draw some blood from her boyfriend, either with her nails or her fangs. He seemed okay with it. I talked to her boyfriend for a short while, too. We got along just fine, but we had very little in common, so it was a bit tricky to hold a conversation. He was into sports and cars, so he was probably human. After a while, I tried to encourage them to meet my friends. Verity, however, didn't like that. She was very possessive and insisted that I stay with them all night. I wasn't in the mood to argue with a bloodthirsty historian, and she was being very friendly with me, so I agreed. She didn't bite me once, and I'm grateful her boyfriend was there to feed her. Maybe she was a vampire, or maybe she just had some really weird habits. Either way, I hope you enjoyed my story. I have always been interested in the paranormal and going ghost hunting, as me and my friends called it. This story takes place on an October night in 2005. We had gathered at my dad's house for a party. We lived way out in the country in an old farmhouse. We decided to drive up the road to an old cemetery because one of my friends showed up with a Ouija board. I said we weren't going to use it at my house, but I was game to use it somewhere else. About 6 of us piled into different vehicles and took off. When we got there, we set the Ouija board up on an old concrete barrier that surrounded the entrance of the cemetery. For context, the cemetery was set on a hill surrounded by cow pastures, fields, and trees. Across the road stood an old, white church. There were 2 security lights that lit the church area and the entrance to the cemetery. There was one more security light that lit the field next to the only house for about 2 miles. We all stood in a circle, planchette in the centers, hands all on it. My friend led the seance and asked if there was anything in the cemetery with us. At first nothing happened and we all stood still and quiet. Then the planchette slowly moved toward yes. Immediately we all started accusing each other of moving it, but everyone swore that they didn't. An eerie feeling fell over us as the planchette moved back to the center of the board. About that time, we heard what sounded like wind initially, but began to get closer. It sounded like the footsteps of multiple people running in circles all around us. We were all wide-eyed, looking at each other when someone said, "I'm out." Another person said, "We have to tell it bye or the spirits will follow." The leader of the group spoke to the board and said something along the lines of, "We are saying goodbye to you," and the planchette quickly jerked to no. It was pretty obvious by how shocked we all were that none of us had done that. Mind you, the sound of the footsteps are still surrounding us. The planchette moves to the center and we say bye again. Again, it moves to no, then back to the center. This time we all say it together, my friend's idea, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, moved the planchette to the word goodbye. We were relieved and took off running to the cars, which were parked at the entrance of the cemetery on the side of the road. Me and a buddy jump into my truck, and I hear my friend scream something about not being able to find their keys. She checks the ignition, her pockets. All our friends check the car and their pockets. No keys. Everyone else loads back into the truck, and we speed the 3 miles down the road to my dad's house. My friend searches her purse and pockets for the keys again, and again we couldn't find them anywhere. Eventually, someone takes her home, and she says she'll get her spare and get a ride back to her car in the morning. We were all too scared to go back and look that night. The next day, my friend searches the cemetery and never finds the keys, even in broad daylight. We hadn't walked around a whole lot, and where we used the Ouija board was very close to where we had parked our cars. Me and several friends scoured the entire cemetery over the next week or so and never did find them. My friend said she was 100% positive that they were left in the ignition when she got out of the car. It's where I left mine, and a common practice in the area where I'm from, which, like I said, is pretty rural. This was by far my scariest, but not the only, Ouija board experience that I have. A couple of years ago, I worked at a hospital as security, and part of security duties for the second shift was to lock all doors downstairs in the basement of the hospital. The type of things down there ranged from offices, supply rooms, bathrooms, and the morgue. We would also have to check the refrigeration temp inside the morgue to make sure it was running properly, but that's not important. So one night I go down to the basement, which is basically a big rectangle, locked all the doors, and just as I was going to make a right to take the stairs up, I noticed someone walk out of the corner in what looked like blue scrubs. They took about 5 steps into one of the doors I had locked. They didn't open the door or anything, just walked right through. As security, I couldn't just brush it off because recently we had people steal from the supply room, so I had to check it out, especially since it was after hours. As I walked up to the door, I immediately got goosebumps, because this specific door was 1, an automatic locking door that can only be accessed by ID clearance, and 2, I didn't see the individual pull out an ID, which you have to get in. You pull out the ID, scan, and wait for the green light to pop up to open the door. I literally just saw someone take about 5 steps into the door like it was open wide, which it wasn't. The door automatically locks and closes itself. I think to myself, well, if someone accessed the door after hours, they aren't allowed to, so this might be the person that's stealing stuff. If a nurse or someone needs to go to the supply room, they call security, and security escorts them because of stealing incidents. So I pull out my ID, scan it, and open the door. I walked in and saw nobody. Then I opened all the closet doors to confirm that nobody was hiding, and then immediately got the F out, because I was 100% sure that I had just seen a ghost. Later that night, I got a call from the ER department to escort a nurse down to the supply room. When I escorted her down there, into the supply room and told her what I had seen, she shuffled through some boxes in the supply room and pulled out the same exact blue scrubs that I had seen the ghost wearing. Except they weren't scrubs. They were the blue gowns that patients wear inside the hospital. So what I had actually seen that night was a patient's ghost walking around the basement. After this experience, I definitely believe in ghosts and the afterlife. To this day, I kick myself for not looking at the cameras that night. So I've been doing some spirit box investigation at the house I share with my fiancé. The last 2 nights we've done this together, we have discovered that there are 4 spirits in our home. Bob is the calmest one. When I mentioned that we spoke to a spirit named Bob in the house, my fiancé's cousin mentioned that Bob is her grandfather who passed. His name is actually Robert, but everyone just called him Bob. Mind you, we share the house with her cousin and uncle. Knowing that Bob isn't a threat, I've gotten the other names of the 3 spirits left. Those being Toby, Eric, and Melissa. The female spirit, I can't say for sure if that's her name. Anytime I've tried to reassure the name, I don't get a response. And whenever I'm about to, it's like something is stopping her. She does indeed like to laugh, as she has done so 3 times in the last 2 days. Anytime I hear from her, she's giving a yes or no answer with occasional other sentences. Toby is, from what I understand, a good spirit, although I've seen him as a dark shadow next to our bathroom, and this was earlier today while I was home alone, with most of the lights out. The main part of this story that I'm getting into now is Eric. So upon using the spirit box, about 20 minutes ago before the post, I had asked multiple questions, but I'm going to get into the more interesting ones. One of the questions I asked after I got his name was if he was a good or an evil spirit. I got no response, and then I asked if he was a good spirit. I get a response this time, and he says yes, very clearly. Since I know that demons can lie and try to trick you of what they really are, I decided to ask if he was lying to me. He responded once more by saying, yeah. I was then able to confirm that he is the one spirit who is demonic. Things started making sense at this point, as clearly today, when I was home alone, when my spirit box was on, I noticed our kitchen chair was knocked over, and I took a picture of it and sent it to my fiancée to show her. It also explained why I always felt uncomfortable and watched in our garage that we rarely enter now. I had asked him about both of these things, even trying to make sure that he wasn't the shadow figure in the hallway leading to our room. He told me that he wasn't, which led me to assume it was Toby. He did reply to me that the garage is where he hides at. Most of the talk that I had with him after was him saying, come. The female spirit as well was trying to convince me to go into our garage. At the time, though it didn't cross my mind that they were mentioning it, I was trying to ask where they want me to go. I didn't get any straightforward response about the question. I was told leave me alone or go on multiple occasions today and tonight. Upon ending my spirit box session, I went to the kitchen to grab something to eat. I ended up feeling some weird sensation on the left side of my collarbone, almost like something had touched me or dug into my skin softly. I went to the restroom to comb my hair and checked my neck and person for any kind of marks. I ended up noticing that there was a fingerprint on my collarbone. It almost looked the size of a young male's hand, or maybe a little older. I wanted to capture a picture, but when I went to do so, the marking was gone. All I know now is that there is something evil here, and there are more spirits than me or my fiancé thought. This is by far the spookiest experience my family and I have had regarding the paranormal. I'm currently living in Australia, and this all started when I moved into my current house around 3 years ago. In my culture, we believe that whenever a family moves into a new home, a priest should come to perform various prayers to bless the house. However, when my mom bought the house, we immediately went on holiday for 3 months, so we were unable to perform the rituals. Everything started when we first came back home. Just some background, my mom raised me on her own, so it was just the 2 of us staying in the house at the time. I was still in high school, and my mom worked in the city, so we both took the train every morning. She always left home earlier than me, so it was my job to lock up each day. She also worked late almost every day, so I would get home first and be home alone for at least 5 hours. One morning as I left home, I began to feel paranoid that I had not locked the door, so I walked back to check it. The door was locked. Later that day, when I came home, I walked up my driveway to find that the door was wide open. I freaked out, but was brave enough to go inside. Our kitchen is pretty close to the entrance, so I grabbed a knife and searched the entire house. There was no one there. I decided to not tell my mom because she was really stressed with work and I didn't want her to freak out too. Over the next few days, another strange thing started to happen. Our garage door would randomly open whenever we were home. My mom was kind of scared, but then we thought maybe our neighbor's garage remote functioned at the same frequency or something and it was activating our door too, so we dismissed it. It had been about 2 months since we were living in our new house, and everything seemed to be normal again. Until one day when I was awoken in the middle of the night by my mom. She looked super scared and asked me if I had come into her room to wake her up. I said no, I was half asleep and had no idea what she was rambling on about. She didn't believe me and made me swear that I hadn't. I always play scare pranks on my family, so that was why. I swore I didn't and asked her what was up. She is a super light sleeper, and so while she was sleeping, she heard someone prop her door open. She looked up and saw the figure of a boy and thought it was me. She asked it, "What's wrong?" and blinked. There was nothing there, and her door was still open. She called my name a few times and there was no response, hence why she came to my room. I have to admit, given the stuff happening with the doors, I was kinda scared, but I convinced my mom that she was imagining things and she went back to sleep. Ever since that night, and up to this day, my mom still sleeps with her door open and the living room light on. And I do not blame her after what happened next. 2 weeks after this incident occurred, my mom's best friend and her son and daughter, who were both around my age, came over from our homeland, Malaysia, to visit us. I was really excited, as I have always been close to them. One thing you should know about my aunt. She's had many experiences growing up with the paranormal, and so she is super afraid of ghosts. For this reason, me and her kids always used to play pranks on her. One day the 4 of us were playing poker on the dining room table while my mom was taking a nap in the living room. Suddenly my mom rushes out of the living room, her eyes wide open, and she looked terrified. She asked who had woken her up from her nap. The 4 of us were dumbfounded, as we had just been playing cards the entire time. She then told us that she felt someone tap her shoulder while she was asleep. When she opened her eyes, there were 2 feet on the floor. Once again she blinked, and the feet were gone, and there was no one there. My mom was having a full-on breakdown, especially after what had happened the other night. Then my aunt, given how afraid she was of ghosts, started to melt down as well. I didn't want her holiday to be ruined, so I managed to convince them that my mom was probably in the middle of a dream, so when she woke up, she was most likely hallucinating. Yeah, I know, it sounds stupid, but hey, it worked. But then the next day, something else happened. My mom had gone to the shops to get groceries. The kids and I were playing video games in the living room, while their mom was having a shower. Suddenly we hear the bathroom door burst open, and out runs my aunt wrapped in her towel. She screamed at us, telling us to stop trying to scare her, and that it wasn't funny. The 3 of us were extremely confused, and her daughter asked her what had happened. She told us that she knew we were the ones knocking on the bathroom door, even after she told us to stop 3 times. I know it probably seems like she was overreacting, but again, I cannot emphasize her fear of ghosts. I exchanged a concerned look with her kids, and then told her that it genuinely was not us, and that we were playing FIFA the entire time. Soon my mom got home and we told her what happened also. Let's just say that my aunt started sleeping with her room lights on for the rest of her trip. Soon she and her kids had gone home, and it was back to me and my mom again. We returned to our regular routine. My mom was finally at peace, and she hadn't seen anything for a while apart from the garage door opening on its own every now and then. The same, however, could not be said for me. It seemed that it had become my turn to be tormented. As I mentioned before with my mom at work, I would be home alone for a few hours every day. I began to start to hear things. The strange bit is that it would never occur while I was in the living room. Whenever I went to use the toilet or went to sit in my room, I would start hearing things coming from the living room and kitchen. It started out small, just the sound of some panting like if you had run a marathon, that kind of panting. But the minute I entered the living room, nothing. There would be no sound at all. It soon started to get worse. I would hear footsteps pacing around outside my room and spoons and pots falling in the kitchen. But every time I step out into the living room again, the noises would stop, and everything would be just as I left it. There was even a time when I thought I heard a kid laughing right outside the door when I was in the toilet. I decided not to tell my mom again because she seemed to be getting over her experiences and I didn't want to scare her all over. But one day I felt that I needed to tell her, and we decided that day that it was time we contacted our priest to perform the prayers for our house. It was the day my best friend and his parents came over for dinner. When it all began, it was a completely innocent meal. My best friend and his family are Malaysian too, and we were having a great time talking about home while having a signature Malaysian dish. My friend's dad was telling us a story when all of a sudden his face just froze, and his eyes widened. He honestly looked like he was having a stroke. His face contorted into a frown, and he just stared down at the table. My mom and I shared a worrying look, but my friend and his mom just continued eating like nothing was happening. Suddenly, his dad seemed to return to us, and he continued telling the story as if nothing had occurred. But he could see that my mom and I were visibly concerned. Suddenly, his wife tapped his shoulder and said, "Just tell them." He frowned at his wife and just kept eating. There was an awkward silence for a few minutes, and then he finally decided to address the elephant in the room. He apologized for scaring us and assured us that there was no need to worry. He then went on to tell us about his life. Since he was a child, he had been very religious, and from a young age he felt a very close connection to God. He regularly meditated and was very, very spiritual. So spiritual that when he was in his mid-20s, he had awoken with a gift. He was able to see dead people. I kid you not, when he said this, I immediately looked at my friend, waiting for him to start laughing at some prank. But my friend's face was completely serious, and he continued looking at his dad as the man told his story. He told us he could see them everywhere, when he was walking his dog on the street, when he's sitting in the park, in people's houses, and even sometimes sitting on people who had been possessed. He said the spirits were drawn to him because they knew that he could see them, and they would stalk him, begging him to help them reach the afterlife. He said there was simply nothing he could do because these people had died before their time, and they would simply have to wait on Earth until it was their time. Back home, he was regularly contacted by people having paranormal experiences to perform a cleansing or drive evil spirits away. He told us about some of those experiences, but I don't feel like it's my place to share them here. He then asked us something that gave me chills. "Have you guys performed prayers for your house yet?" My mom refused to answer the question until he told her why he had asked it. He said that he didn't want to worry us, but that if we hadn't, we probably should. My mom continued to ask him why until he finally conceded. This is what he said. "Remember when I had that moment just now while I was talking? I had a visit. I won't tell you what it was, but it was the same spirit that I saw standing at the front door when we came in here." That's when my mom told him everything that had been happening. It was during this time that I also decided to tell my mom about the things that I had been hearing in the house. My friend's dad then told us that he did not think it was a malicious spirit, but to be safe, and that it was time for us to conduct the prayers. Before he left, he asked my mom if he could see our altar in the prayer room. My mom took him to it and we all followed. As he stood in front of the altar, his whole body shook, as if he just had a huge hiccup. He then put his hands together and bowed his head. Before leaving, he said, "I can see why the two of you have not been hurt. You're protected." That concluded our visit. A week later, we arranged for a priest from our local temple to cleanse and bless our home. I promise you that ever since that day, nothing strange has ever happened in our house. Even the garage door has stopped opening on its own. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I have learned my lesson. I will never move into a house without performing the rituals that my culture demands. Setting: hospital, medical surgery floor. Profession: staff nurse. This happened yesterday, and I have 2 nursing students as living proof. We basically carry those indestructible Nokia cell phones around at work. If you hit the call bell, they ring to the aide's phone first, then it bounces to my phone. Yesterday, a call bell came in from an all-female room. My phone put itself on speakerphone and answered itself. A male voice repeated on a loop with a 4 to 5 second delay, "Are you there?" At the time, I was giving a report to 2 nursing students, 1 male, 1 female. The incident happened after we had just started talking about near-death experiences. We all went white and got goosebumps. The female student said, "Well, you're haunted." It was unbelievable. The male student calmly said, "Yes, we are here." This had never happened before. Those phones don't repeat. Absolutely amazing. I went into the room later and opened the window and told him he was dead and that he needed to move on. What an experience for the students. This has never happened to me before, but I hope it happens again, and that I have the courage to do what the male student did. I was 15 when the first time anything paranormal happened to me at this boarding school. For a month, I would have sleep paralysis. The next month, it got 10 times worse. As well as sleep paralysis, I would feel someone or something patting my head. I would open my eyes, and no one was there. This would carry on for a little while, until one night when I had sleep paralysis again and I looked over to the other side of the room and saw a slightly washed out figure of a woman wearing a maid's costume. This happened for a couple more nights until I left that school. I came back to that school for 6th form, the last 2 years of high school if you're American. It all started up again when I was moved into that same dorm, but this time she followed me around the school. In the end, I prayed for her. However, she still follows me around when I wear a certain necklace to this day. The last story I have is about 18-year-old me messing around with a Ouija board. Please don't do this. So my boyfriend at the time was the one who bought the Ouija board. A good friend had just died a couple of months ago. We messed around with it for a little bit until the planchette started to levitate. I somehow went into a trance for what felt like about 30 seconds. However, I got told it was for 5 minutes. When I came out of this trance, I had 3 scratches down my arm. The hand with scratches was red hot to the touch, but the other was ice cold. Of course, we decided to do it again the next night. Something predicted the future. The first thing it said was fire alarm. The next thing was knee surgery. And the last was asylum. As soon as this happened, the fire alarm went off. A year later, I had knee surgery. And then 6 months later, my ex was admitted to a mental facility. I know this sounds far-fetched, but this is what happened. Again, please don't mess around with Ouija boards. I've gathered a few paranormal encrypted stories after moving to North Carolina. The silver UFO, the shadow person, the 6 lights, etc. But this one stuck out to me the most. I've never even heard of this thing or even knew that this thing existed, and I was a kid when I saw it. It could be my mind exaggerating, but another person with me saw it, and it freaked us both out. We were driving along the back roads of North Carolina and learning the shortcuts and ways to get around as we had just moved here. It was the evening, and it was around false summertime, the time where it's hot randomly in the spring, so the windows were rolled down. We were just having fun cruising and sightseeing. The other person with me was driving and was chit-chatting to me about the smells and plants that I should stay away from. We were passing a cow farm, so we rolled up our windows, and the curve past the farm was coming up, so we rolled them back down. Now after you hit this curve, there's a hill and it flattens out into a straight but crummy road. In the middle of the road, something blackish was walking. It was shaggy, and was just walking all calm as if it was sightseeing too. I remember my friend asking, "What's this dog doing?" It looked as big as a black bear or a derpy Saint Bernard, and it walked with a normal stride. We slowly crept up on it, hoping that it would hear the car and move out of the way, but it didn't. So my friend gave the horn a little tap, and this thing finally turned around. Its eyes were reflected from the headlights. It hunched down and hissed. When it turned, its tail lifted, and it was long and black. It then darted off into the woods. My friend was puzzled. I just sat there in disbelief at what I had just witnessed. It was an odd and quiet ride back home. Fast forward to more than a decade later, me and a few friends were looking at local urban legends because one of them swore up and down that they saw the ghost that everyone was talking about and wanted to know more about it. I'm zoning out because I'm an introvert, and went looking around in the website that we found. I see this title called The Vampire Beast of North Carolina, and was like, what the hell? North Carolina's got a hillbilly vampire? I click on it and read. Some beast was terrorizing locals and their farm animals, leaving puncture wounds, no blood, and leaving the body there. Multiple bodies of dead animals in one night, all dead the same way. I scoffed and say El Chupacabra, like Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory, and kept scrolling. I read some more and saw, here's what witnesses recount seeing, and when I scrolled down to see a hand-drawn picture of it, I nearly shat bricks. The photo the eyewitnesses had drawn of what they saw looked exactly like what I had seen over a decade ago. The shape, the tail, the color. I went pale and exited out of the page and just sat there thinking on my life's existence up to this point, wondering if I had some sort of brain damage, because I was like, there's no way that this can be real, what I saw. But what really hit the nail on the coffin was that this thing was attacking people's farm animals, and I had seen this thing by a cow farm. I haven't seen this beast again. I really don't want to because I think it's a bad omen since I have a superstitious family, which is why I think paranormal and odd occurrences happen to us. Whenever we do have odd experiences, we don't speak about it to each other. This isn't my story, rather that of my parents and two incredibly close family friends. Before I was born, the four of them used to hang out a lot. They would often drive out far into the Mojave Desert to party and drink around a fire, just have a good time in general. So they drove way out into the desert to have their friendly ritual. It was summertime and incredibly hot. Even late into the night, it still wouldn't have been cold. My mom, Stacy, and her friend Gina started getting scared about tarantulas at one point. They decided that they didn't want to camp out there after all. That's when all four of them began driving back. It was around 2 a.m. They were on a dirt road that went on for miles with no sign of civilization anywhere along the way. Suddenly, up ahead in the headlights, they saw what appeared to be a man in a long black trench coat, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The collar of his coat was pulled up. He was walking along the side of the road in the same direction that they were driving. My dad had grown up hitchhiking a lot, and used to pick up hitchhikers as well, so my mom knew that he would probably consider stopping and talking to this guy to see if he needed a ride. But then, they all got a terrible feeling about him. My mom always told me that the way he was walking, the way he looked and dressed, and how he was in the middle of nowhere. Him and the whole scenario were emitting this really messed up energy that came off as horrifying and evil. Gina felt the same way. My dad starts joking, "Hey, let's pick this guy up." And my mom and Gina immediately started screaming and crying, begging him not to. They were in the back seat. My dad was driving, and their other friend Brad was in the front passenger seat. Gina even started punching my dad in the back, yelling at him not to stop. I guess my dad slowed way down as they passed, and they all turned to look at him as they went by. However, the moment the nose of the car actually passed him, he was gone. It was as if he disappeared into thin air. It wasn't as if there were rocks or trees for him to hide behind either. The weirdest thing of all is that I grew up hearing this story from my parents, but living very far away from their friends. When I was very young, we moved up north and they lost touch, even though whenever we would come back to California to visit, we would always get together with them, and it would be as if nothing had changed. I moved back here to California as an adult, and I work for Gina now. One of our first conversations when I came back was about the Hat Man. She brought it up, not me. And she told me word for word the exact same story that my parents had always told me. To be honest, I've always secretly feared yet been simultaneously intrigued by this entity because of hearing this story. Of course, now I've seen so many others online to compare it to that I am more fascinated than ever. I was working at this hospital called Warren General in Warren, Pennsylvania, about 90 minutes east of Erie, Pennsylvania. I worked night shift. I'm a travel RN, so this was one of the hospitals that I traveled to. One night my floor was slow, so I got pulled down to the CCU to work. Well, that night my patient rang her call bell at 3 o'clock in the morning and she asked me, "What does she want?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The nurse keeps coming in here and standing there in that corner," and she points to the corner behind the door. So I was like, "Who, Ashley?" That was the nurse I was working with, and I pointed to her because she was sitting at the nurse's station on the computer, and the woman says, "No, the other one." Well, there was no other one. It was just us two. And FYI, the patient was a woman in her 50s and didn't have any history of mental illness and was not taking any meds that would make her hallucinate. I kind of laughed, and I was like, "It's just us." And she just stares at me, so I say, "Okay, if she does it again, just yell for me and I'll come right in." Her room was 8 feet in front of the nurse station. About half an hour goes by, and she yells, "See, there you go again." I got up, started walking. I hear the bathroom door shut. It had been cracked open just a little bit to give her dark room a little light. I walk in and I say, "See, you're dreaming. There's no one else in here." She says, "No, she went in the bathroom." I open the door and the lights are still on, but no one is in there. Looking confused, I say, "What does she look like?" Because I thought that someone was messing around. "It's too dark to tell. I can tell it's a woman, but she's so dark that I can't really make her face out." When she says that, I get a little weirded out. But the night ends and I forget about it. 3 months go by. I get pulled back down to the same unit. I have the same room as before. This time a man in his early 60s in the patient room. Nice guy, alert and oriented and very polite. Night is going good. It's about 3 a.m. and his call light goes off, which means he needs something. So I walk in and he says to me, "You are my nurse, right?" And I nod my head. And he says, "Well, why does that lady keep coming in here and standing in that corner? What is she doing?" What? I almost crapped my pants instantly. This was 3 months later. Same room, same thing. I said to him, "Honestly, I think it's a ghost, sir." And he laughs. And I say, "You're not the first person to say that." I started telling everyone about it. And then I find out that the entire second floor has a nurse that's seen every once in a while. I guess in the 1990s, a nurse who worked there committed suicide. She shot herself to death in the second floor bathroom. I would like to share my recent experience. This is absolutely true and in no way fabricated. I have been shaken up immensely and my perspective on reality has definitely changed. I live in India and my family is Protestant Christian. My upbringing and the things taught to me in terms of faith have included an aspect of the supernatural and the spiritual. Though it was always told to me that demons and spirits of darkness exist, I was always a skeptic. I believed in proof, evidence, and logic. In my opinion, exorcisms were staged and everything about it was fake, until I had what seems to be my own personal experience with the demonic. This happened about a week ago. I was on my bed, playing a racing game on my phone at 2 a.m. The lights were off, and the only light was that of my phone. I usually put my AirPods on and keep my volume on full as I enjoyed the loud engine revving sounds of the game. I started feeling an ache in my back, and this made me think I was having another bout of kidney stone pain. It runs in my family. My way of coping with it is to just ignore it and move on with things. I've had multiple stones in my body, so I have learnt to manage the discomfort well by now. As I continued with the game, I started feeling breathless as the air was heavy. It came to a point where I thought something was definitely wrong. There was a dull pain in my stomach and head too. The sounds and music of the game I was playing became very muffled and scary. I managed to pull out my headphones and lie down. I laid out on the bed, on my back, looking up at the ceiling, wondering what was going on. My wife is working abroad for now, and I really wanted to ring her. I was not able to do that, however, because somehow logic and common sense had taken a back seat at that moment. I just wasn't able to think clearly. My palms and forehead were covered in sweat, and felt crushed like under weight of something terribly heavy. I honestly thought I was about to die. My mom had visited me in March of this year and has not been able to since leave and head back to her own house due to the lockdown. So she was sleeping in the guest room and usually fast asleep at that hour. My mom is a very deep sleeper and rarely gets up for anything in the night. During all this madness that I was going through, she just woke up and came to my door and knocked. I heard the knocks, and I wanted to say, "Please come in and help me," but my mind was too confused to do anything. She heard some groaning-like sounds coming from me and decided to let herself in. When I looked at her, I wanted to say help, but apparently I kept saying, "Just let me be. Let me die in peace." My mom told me this later. When she saw me in the state that I was, without any hesitation, she touched my head and said, "In the name of Yeshua, I bind you, rebuke you, and cast you out." I felt the immediate sensation of wanting to puke. I rushed to the loo and did so. Instantly, I felt better, and my mind began working correctly. I could think straight and had no trouble breathing. The whole recovery didn't take more than a couple of minutes. While I know that this can be dismissed as a simple case of indigestion or acidity, food poisoning, or even an anxiety attack, here are some reasons why it's got to be more. 1. The probability of my mom walking in that time was very low. Later, when I asked her why she came in at that hour, she simply said, "Because I felt like I should." Like a prompting in my spirit. 2. Why would I say things like, "Just let me die"? Any person in need of medical attention will cry for help rather than wanting to be left alone. 3. Why did I need to puke just after my mom said those words? 4. I had eaten dinner at 5 p.m. If it had something to do with that, why would it surface at 2 in the morning the next day? And 5. About a month before all this happened, I had a nightmare about an entity in my room. Something that looked like a black being with red eyes and teeth like a wolf, grinding its teeth at me or making low-pitched growls. I was scared after that, but I had dismissed it and moved on. I am really beginning to think that what I went through was a spiritual demonic oppression, which retreated due to the compulsion from a higher spiritual authority. So I'm a week out of the hospital after spending 2 weeks in there with COVID-19 and pneumonia. I have a lot of serious health issues and barely survived my stay, but at the end of my stay, I was woken up at about 4 a.m. by the nurse coming in to give me more antibiotics and change my fluid drip. She left to get a new tube for the drip, and whilst she did that, I rolled over in my bed and saw an elderly man standing at the end of my bed with his hand on the bed at the bottom, as he was looking out the window. Initially, I thought it was one of the elderly gents on the same ward, wandering into my room again. It had happened multiple times, as they all had dementia or delirium, so I spoke to him and asked him if he was all right, but he didn't respond. I buzzed for the nurse and she came back in a rush, and the man vanished before my eyes, and I believe before the nurse's too, as she stopped and stared for a moment, before shaking her head and continuing. I tried asking about it, but she kept telling me that I must be dreaming. Every time she came back into my room, she looked at the same spot where he had been. I'm not sure what I actually did see that night, and I didn't recognize the man at all. At the time of this story, I was a 16-year-old high school student. I got a babysitting job for a couple who had a family wedding and needed a babysitter for a super late night. I was referred to them by another family that I used to sit for. Keep in mind, this was when cell phones were just coming out, so I had a really crappy flip phone with a certain amount of minutes. There were 3 kids. The oldest was a boy about 8, the middle boy was about 6, and there was a little girl who was a toddler in diapers and couldn't speak. I came in while the sun was still up to meet the kids while the parents were still there. The parents were so cool. They showed me where all the snacks were and gave me the ground rules for the night. Kids in bed by 7:30, teeth brushed, you know the drill. Once they left, we started eating dinner. To my shock, the middle child, who we'll call Teddy, kept throwing his fork hard at his siblings and pinching his sister with his nails under the table. He kept kicking my shins and throwing his food around the room. The moment his parents left, he became a terror. Their house was old but remodeled, so their toys were in the basement playroom. After dinner, we all went in there to play. As soon as we went down the stairs, it felt wrong. Don't get it twisted. It was a beautiful finished basement with a couch, flat screen, and toys, but something just felt creepy about it. Then the little girl kept pointing at a blank wall, one with no pictures or anything on it, and kept screaming at the top of her lungs and crying. It really unnerved me. At this point, I'm getting a terrible, really bad feeling. So I say, let's go upstairs and watch TV till bedtime. The kids seem to love that idea. So I carry the little girl upstairs and turn on the TV for the 3 of them and then go back down to grab her favorite stuffed dog and clean up a bit. When I turn around to walk upstairs, I see Teddy smiling a sickening smile at the top of the stairs. He has his hands on the light switch. My stomach dropped. I didn't have my phone or a light. And if this little shit locks me down here, I thought. The light switch is at the top of the stairs outside the stairway, so if he closed the door, I was screwed. And sure enough, he flicked off the lights, cackled, and went to slam the door and lock me in the dark basement. I have never moved so fast in my existence. I flew up the stairs and shoved my hand into the door to keep him from locking me down there. I asked him why he did that and yelled at him to never do that again. All he did was smile at me and then slowly walk away, giggling. I iced my hand and watched him closely for the rest of the night. Bedtime comes around, and I put the kids to bed upstairs without any problems. There were 3 bedrooms, the parents' room at the end of the long hall, then the baby girl's room in the middle, and the boys shared a room with the bunk bed at the end of the hall by the top of the stairs. Everything finally seemed quiet, and I began to forget the horrors from earlier and started watching TV. About an hour after I put her down, the baby girl started screaming through the baby monitor. A scream that sounded like she was in pain. Thinking her brother Teddy was bothering her, I ran upstairs to stop him. As soon as I get to the top of the stairs, I see him laying down on his bed facing the wall. The baby is hysterical and is again pointing at nothing and crying. I am freaked out by now. I rock the baby back to sleep, check on the boys, then return to the living room. What the hell is happening? Am I imagining things? I shake it off and turn the TV back on. This is when the night goes from bad to a total nightmare. Once back in the living room, I start to hear screaming every couple minutes. What sounds this time like a grown man screaming in pain. At first I thought it was outside or maybe a TV or a radio, so I ignored it and kept watching television. But soon it became clear that it wasn't a joke And it wasn't my imagination. It was coming from inside the house. Then, I hear what sounds like little feet running upstairs in the hallway. For a second, I'm not scared anymore. I'm angry that Teddy's out of bed 2+ hours after bedtime. I go to the bottom of the stairs and holler up Teddy's name and tell him to go back to sleep. I don't hear a response, but I do hear the footsteps continue. Then I hear what I think is him run into his parents' room at the other end of the hall. Feet pounding down the hallway, clear as day. So I sprint up there, thinking I've caught him in the act. The hall is empty and dark. I turn, and I find Teddy is sitting up in his bed. He's staring at me again with that sickening smile. I could see his brother was asleep on the top bunk, and I could see that his baby sister was asleep on the monitor in my hand. He gave me the creeps. I told him to lay back down. I go back downstairs to the middle floor. I then hear someone walking up from the basement, and I lost it. I slammed and locked the basement door, and I called my house number. My big brother answers, and I tell him that I'm scared. He puts me on speaker, and I explain everything to my family. I babysit every weekend, and I've never had a negative experience or called them like this, so luckily they believed me. My grandpa, being a super religious man, prayed with me and calmed me down. My big brother got into his car and came to sit with me until the parents got home, but the town I was in was a bit of a drive, so he told me he'd be there in 40 minutes. Even after we hung up, I could hear the footsteps running around the house. I am not a religious person, but I sat on the couch and prayed and cried. I have never been so scared in my life. I was terrified. The parents came home before my brother got there, and they saw that I had been crying. They asked what happened, and I told them everything non-supernatural that occurred because I didn't want them to think I was a crazy person or tell people not to hire me. I just wasn't going to mention it at all. So I just said Teddy was a handful, and that was it. As I was leaving, the dad, in a deadly serious voice, said, "Did the ghost bother you?" I slowly turned to him, not fully believing what I had just heard. I asked him if he was being serious. He said, "Oh, I'm being serious. We've had a ghost problem for a while now. Did you experience anything yourself?" I broke down and started crying when I gave them an honest recap of the night. I told them about the screams that I heard, the footsteps, everything. How the baby was crying at the wall, and how Teddy tried locking me in the basement. They believed me right away. The parents said they'd moved into the house about 2 years ago after the old man who built the house died inside of it. He was an actual hoarder and fell and injured himself in the basement and died among his piles. Since no one could hear him scream, they didn't find him in time. By all accounts from the neighborhood, he was a mean recluse of a man. Either way, what a terrible way to go. They said they would wake up every night to things flying off of their kitchen counters and doors slamming. They would hear knocks and pounding in the walls. I was shocked. I asked why they stayed in the house if they knew it was haunted. They explained they weren't able to move due to their jobs and current financial situation. I have to admit that although it wasn't huge, it was a beautifully built home. That old construction kind of home with bookshelves built into the walls and a winding grand staircase. The dad said he would go downstairs every night for a year and say, "Go away. This is our home now. You aren't welcome here," over and over. He said eventually the activity stopped. They said it only sparked up when someone new would stay in the house or when they'd have a sitter at night. They said since I quote-unquote knew the truth now, that they would pay me extra to come back because they could never keep a babysitter. Yeah, right, I thought. I am never going back there. But I said I'd be in touch, and I ran out of that house. I am ashamed to say that I never answered their calls again. I felt bad, but there was no way in hell I'd ever return there. I still babysit once in a while, and I've never had any experience like that since. I still think of those kids sometimes, and I really think that Teddy was being affected by the spirit there. I've never encountered a child so cruel, so negative. Thinking of his creepy little smile still sends a chill down my back. I hope they were able to move or clear the negative energy. Either way, it's one night I won't forget. Here is the chilling tale of one of my stepmoms, who we'll call Lisa here, experiences with ghosts that she has conjured through her old Ouija board. So Lisa had just divorced her ex-husband and was living alone in a new house with her 2 kids. She moved to get away from the torturous spirits or demons in her old house. She was settling down with a broken heart and a new life. She went to bed after forgetting to pray one night. She did this because it was what the priest told her to do to solve her problems with the paranormal. It seemed to work, she told me, but when I didn't do it, it would all come back. Lisa had no paranormal experiences while she was in that house. Until now. On the night she didn't pray. Her oldest kid was 7 and now sleeping alone. Her youngest was 3, and Lisa kept her sleeping in her room because she felt like she had to keep an eye on her. Because of all the experiences, she was a worrywart. Anyway, she falls asleep and wakes up to 3 knocks. She knows this all too well. She lit a sage, prayed, and went back to sleep. This didn't work. That night she kept hearing scratches on her wall above her head. She turns to look up and sees a face in the pitch black dark. Lisa just woke up and thought it was her imagination. But then came a feeling of impending doom. A feeling also that she knew too well. She turns on her lamp, turns around to see a black mist looming next to her bed. She grabs her daughter who is sleeping with her and grabs a Bible. She screams for the mist to go away and everything calms down. She flicks on the light, paces around the room, and looks over to where she heard the scratching sounds earlier. To her horror, she sees 3 scratch marks the size of tiger claws above her bed on the wall. The scratches were on her wall until she put up new wallpaper. I asked her stepdaughters. One of them remembers her mom screaming at a wall. She never saw what my stepmom saw, but they wondered why they saw the scratch marks. So before some of y'all say I'm making this up, it's not my responsibility to prove it. All this started when I was in middle school. I was young and stupid and seriously interested in the paranormal. I grew up in a religious home, and I am still religious. I have no explanation for what happened to me. I started experimenting with the paranormal with my friends. We thought it would be really cool to use a Ouija board. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then the board started to move. We asked all the normal stupid questions like, "Who's there?" or "Is anyone here?" It moved really slow and steady. I was sure that my friend was messing with me. I got spooked and we threw out the board. But that is not where this story ends. Moving forward, I started having really weird nightmares. I would consistently wake up at 3 a.m. or not be able to sleep at all. I was basically a zombie throughout my entire day. There was one time when I was at home alone on FaceTime when I heard my mom yell my name. I yelled back and didn't get a response. My friend then reminded me that I was home alone. I immediately checked my whole house and no one was there. She heard the voice too though, so it couldn't be explained. I continued hearing voices and knocks and was still unable to sleep. There was one time where I was in my room doing homework and someone pulled my hair so hard that my head actually yanked down. I got so spooked that I ran to my dad and told him what had happened. He obviously didn't really believe me. My brother started noticing weird things too, and that's when I got really uncomfortable. He and I were in my room, and I went to the bathroom. When I came out, his face was stone white. He claimed he saw a little girl run past my bedroom door. It couldn't have been me because I used the bathroom connected to my room. We don't have any other siblings. Another time I was on FaceTime again with a separate friend and I had my phone out in front of me when I walked into my bathroom. My friend asked, "What is that behind you?" And as soon as she said that, the lights shut off. I sprinted to my brother's room and of course nobody believed me again. The icing on the cake though was when I was asleep one night and I woke up suddenly. It was 3 a.m. again and I was completely paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. All I could see was a hooded figure in all black staring at me from the corner of my room. I couldn't see its eyes. I just knew that it was looking at me. It began to float toward me, and then pressed all of its weight on my chest. I couldn't talk or move. After silently crying for what felt like forever, I finally croaked out the word Jesus, and it fled from the room through my door. After that incident, I told my mom everything about the Ouija board and the experiences, and she finally believed me. She could see how scared that I truly was and knew that I couldn't be lying. She immediately got to work and blessed me and the house. I haven't had anything that terrifying happen to me since, and I no longer live in that home. When I was a kid, I lived in a little one-story house with my dad, my older sister, and my stepmom. It was a nice and quiet place. We had hardwood floors and there was a hallway leading from the living room into where the bedrooms were. It was a rather dark hallway which turned to the left and led to a guest bedroom and my parents' bedroom. The reason it was dark was because there was just a single dim light on the ceiling between the two bathrooms and the second bedroom, which was at the end of the hallway before it turned left. There was also an attic door right above the master bedroom's door. We never really opened it. It's weird. It just didn't feel like we had permission to, even though we did and could use it any time. I can recall one day after school I returned home to the house being empty. My sister was at a friend's house and my parents went out to try and surprise us with McDonald's before we came back home. I remember calling out my sister's name to see if she was home as well as my mom and dad's name, and no one responded. I went into my parents' bedroom where they had a computer. I sat down and started to turn it on, hoping to get a few minutes of gaming in before my parents came back. As I sat there, the room felt like it was getting darker, but I told myself that my eyes were just adjusting to the computer monitor in front of me. The computer which was taking a rather long time to boot up. Back then, I was maybe 10 years old. I looked around the room to see if my eyes would adjust, but it was still extremely dark even though the light was on, and it just seemed like they couldn't. It also started to feel colder and colder. and when I looked up again, the ceiling was completely black, and the darkness shrouded the light above me with a thick black haze. Immediately, I looked back at the computer to compose myself and tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just a kid that was creeped out for no reason. As I focused on the monitor, the room was cold and quiet. And suddenly, a woman's voice whispered shortly and sternly, my name. I could feel the wind on my ear and the pressure of someone holding my shoulder. I bolted out of the room, and moments later my dad came through the front door smiling and holding a kid's meal in his hand, asking me how my day at school went. I didn't tell him what had just happened. A little while passed, and my dad began having his own experiences in the house. Sometimes he would fall asleep watching his favorite TV shows on the sofa. In the middle of the night, when we had all fallen asleep, he would wake up and hear footsteps walking around the living room. He would also hear chains being dragged across the floor. At the time, we also had a dog. He said that our dog's head would follow the footsteps, and that was how he knew he wasn't just imagining it. The footsteps would lead into the kitchen, pausing for a moment before something dropped from the kitchen counter. Sometimes when one of us was alone in the house, we would hear little girls giggling and laughing in the bathroom at the end of the hall. I remember my dad talking to some of the adults in a serious tone. He said he could see the shadows of two people from underneath the door. He would open it after no reply, and there would be no one there. He would then notice that he was alone in the house. This was a common incident that many of us had experienced ourselves. My stepmom didn't like children, but she hid it very well from my dad. When he would leave for work, he would leave for 15 to 20-hour shifts. Sometimes she would put me in the basement and said if I couldn't behave myself like a person, I would be treated like an animal. The thing about being downstairs is that she would turn off the lights so that you would be downstairs and it would be completely black. It would feel like something was staring at me from the corner of the room. Something that was slowly creeping closer and closer to where I was sitting. Sometimes I would hear feet dragging in the distance, accompanied by tapping sounds similar to fingernails tapping on the concrete floor. This only happened soon after the sun had set and the basement was once again too dark to even see my hand waving in front of my face. As the sounds came closer and closer, I would hug my legs in a fetal position. At that point, I would sing a song from Anastasia, the one that my sister and I used to sing together, and hearing my voice made me feel less alone in that situation. Even as I felt the air thicken and the feeling of something weighing in next to me, waiting for me to open my eyes and take a look. Each time that I did manage to open my eyes in an attempt to see what it was, it would still be so dark that I didn't know if something was there or not. I learned how to toughen up and deal with that thing by treating it like a bully. Just don't let it get to you, don't let it bother you, I would tell myself. But the utter relief of the light turning on and being allowed to come back upstairs and watching my dad pull into the driveway was the best feeling in the world. Another one of my stepmom's favorite punishments would once again be in the basement. She would have my sister and I fold the clothes from the laundry machine. She would later tell one of us to go upstairs and then proceed to throw all of the clothes on the ground, and then tell us to fold it again by ourselves. Downstairs, my sister and I knew that something was not right. The room had a TV and a small, dusty sofa. The door would always be open, and it felt like someone or something wanted you to come inside. It was almost magnetic. At times, we would have to go into the basement room whenever my stepmom had her friends over. We had to be quiet downstairs without a peep, or else she would get upset. Due to the giggling ghosts who were upstairs, we always seemed to get the blame, and were punished according to her mood. When I turned 12 or so, 2 of my dad's brothers moved into the house with us. One of my uncles slept in the guest bedroom, while our other uncle slept in the basement room. Sometimes we would go down there to see if he was hungry. When we entered the room, my uncle would be laying on the sofa with his eyes open, not blinking, and unresponsive. This would go on for a good hour or so. My dad said there wasn't anything downstairs, but he rarely went down there at all. My uncle said that there was something evil, and that it was trying to get into his body. My other uncle, who slept in the guest bedroom, said that when he was asleep he had a dream where a Confederate soldier without eyes kept screaming that they had been taken from him. He woke to see a floating blob of light right in front of his face. I remember one night as my sister and I were falling asleep, my dad kept yelling down the hall from the living room for us to stop talking and get some rest. He said it a few more times before my sister and I said we weren't talking. He then turned off the hallway light and said goodnight. Moments later, I opened my eyes, and behind our bedroom door was a little girl in old pajamas. She had long black hair and nearly blended in with the shadows. I stared at her and then covered my head with my blanket. Later on, 2 of my cousins moved in after my uncles moved out. They had our old bedroom, and my sister and I took the guest bedroom. My cousins were both boys, and we were supposed to help them get used to living with us. They kept fighting with each other. The youngest one would climb into my bed in the middle of the night because he didn't want to fight with his older brother. We had a lock on our bedroom door, and that made him feel better. Also, he did mention that the bedroom scared him, but I didn't ask why. Eventually, the oldest one started to walk around the house at night. We found makeshift weapons like a stick with sharp rocks on it, and a strong thread with something sharp on it as well. He said he was going to kill our stepmother and everyone else in the house. He was maybe just 12 or 13 at the time. Eventually, law enforcement became involved, and he was deemed insane. Once my dad found out about my stepmother's abuse, he swiftly divorced her, and we moved. We never saw her again. One thing I remember is while we were moving out, the landlord stopped by and had baked us all cookies. My dad asked them if anyone had died in the house. The landlords were shocked and said, "Yeah, there was an older lady who died from depression upstairs in the attic." They then asked my dad how he knew. He told them about our experiences. They also mentioned that the house was built on an old battleground. To this day, sometimes I drive past the house and think about knocking on the tenant's door. I want to start this off by saying that I only talk about this because it's part of my healing process and helps me to deal with the trauma of losing my infant son. In 2007, I was 9 months pregnant with my last child. I had had preeclampsia with previous pregnancies and a placenta abruption with a pregnancy 7 years prior, so I was being monitored very closely. Not as closely as I should have been, but that's another story for another time. The evening of December 12th, I became ill. I felt dreadful, and looked at my abdomen and thought that it looked rigid and strange. Instantly, I knew that I was dying. I can't explain it, but simultaneously I heard a whisper in my left ear, a soft, gentle whisper that said, "The baby has died." I instantly thought I was losing my mind, and yelled at my son to call 911. We were in the middle of a winter storm, so our phones were dead. I finally got a neighbor to call my husband, who took me to the maternity ward of a large hospital. One of the most experienced nurses happened to be on duty, thank goodness, because I coded when I got to the floor. I'd had a 3rd-degree abruption. 4th degree is death. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital and had to go on dialysis for a while. My ammonia levels were high, so for quite a bit I thought that I had given birth. I did get to hold him. He was beautiful, with dark curls. When I got to the medical surgery floor, I was coherent and trying to come to grips about why this had happened to me. One night, I had awoken to voices. I thought it was my family in my room. My eyes were closed, but I was awake and heard what sounded like 20 people talking to me. I was lying there, trying to understand what they were saying about me, but all the people were talking so fast and in a hushed tone. I opened my eyes to find no one there. Not one soul. What scared me was that as I opened my eyes, one person said, "Shh." A second person said, "Shh." Then there was a collective, "Shh." I was terrified, in a dark room with the door shut, and I had a hard time moving around because of my emergency C-section incision. I started calling for my husband. He didn't answer. He would often sleep on the floor, beside my bed on a pull-out sofa chair. Suddenly, a small, olive-toned girl of 6 or 7 appeared beside my bed. She had 2 curly ponytails, and was dressed in 1970s-type clothing. I could not see her eyes, just dark shadows. She pointed to the other side of my bed and said, "He's over there." My husband had been on the left side of my hospital bed and was asleep. I turned back to face her, and she was gone. Having that experience in the hospital helped change my insight about death. I know that I will see my infant son again one day. I also think that the people's voices I heard may have been people that had passed away at that hospital, as well as the little girl. I felt no threat at all, but was frightened because this was so unexpected. I've always been pretty sensitive, and so have quite a few people in my family. I've seen dark figures, recorded a few voices, but nothing too major before this story. It was my senior year of high school, and I had been going through a period of what some may like to call paranormal investigating with my friends. We were spending time visiting cemeteries and abandoned houses, like most teenagers do. Just having fun being scared. Well, my friend Tyler found this Ouija board in an abandoned house that he had explored a month or so back and asked me if I wanted it. You see, he knew I was into the paranormal with all the love I had for being scared. I liked scary movies, haunted houses, and anything to get the adrenaline going. So of course I said yes. My friends Alex, David, and I decided to skip school, and I asked them if they wanted to use this Ouija board with me. They were along for the ride, and we had planned to find a place to do this. My house. My house was already known to be haunted because due to some experiences that I had had in my basement. So it seemed like the appropriate choice. Now my friend David didn't believe in anything paranormal. No ghosts or any of that stuff. So he decided to film this for us. Alex is sitting across from me, and I have my hands on the eye by myself. I figured you weren't supposed to do this alone from what I had seen in movies, but we did it anyway, just to see what would happen. Alex begins to ask some questions. Basic ones at first, like, is there anyone here with us? What's your name? What do you want? Alex then asks, are you trying to hurt Chris? And nothing really happens in that moment, but I do remember this distinct chill run down my spine. I brushed it off. We decided to watch the video back on David's phone just to see what it looked like. As we're watching this back, when it comes to the question of, are you trying to hurt Chris? In the video, my head tilts back and I say yes, in 2 different voices. One in my own voice, and one in a deep, guttural voice. We all look at each other and exclaim, oh my God. You didn't say that. You didn't say anything. And needless to say, we got rid of that board and never really talked about it again. But that was one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had. I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no. But I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see 2 bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom. It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny, and to let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. "Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass." "I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school?" "Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it." They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" "No, sir." "Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt." "How can that be?" My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, No, not today," and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind. Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why. A few nights ago, I awoke to being restrained by what I can only describe as a vampire. I'm familiar with the paranormal, but this was a particularly impressive experience. I was pinned to my bed, trapped underneath the body of a young woman. It was as if she was trying to bite me, but at the same time doing everything in her power to stop herself. Or she was doing her best to bite me, but something was preventing her from being able to. She was struggling and jerking, breathing rapidly and kind of growling and snorting. The way she was moving, it was almost as if she was on fast forward. Her teeth were grazing my neck with her mouth wide open. I could feel them against my skin, but was sure that they never penetrated. I was unable to break free and struggled in fear, but realized that I couldn't get away, so just gave in and embraced her. When I embraced her, I found that I actually felt an overwhelming love, despite the disturbing nature of the experience. I had a very clear image of what she looked like. She had long, wavy hair, and somehow resembled myself. I could also feel her intention. Even though she was doing something violent, it was clear to me that she was good at heart. Eventually, because I was alternatively struggling against her, I did break free, and she disappeared. I had a similar experience to this around a year ago, where I awoke to a dark, humanoid shadow being standing beside me, manipulating my energy. That being, however, I felt was inherently evil. This vampiric entity, on the other hand, didn't give off a sinister vibe. It just seemed to me that she was trapped in some kind of karma, unable to control herself. I know about the sleep paralysis demon phenomenon, and that there is supposed to be logical explanation for these occurrences. Honestly, I completely disbelieved in anything supernatural for most of my life. After everything I've experienced, though, it's impossible to deny that these kinds of things are real. Back in the early 2000s, when I was a kid, there was a deserted section of the local hospital waiting to be torn down and rebuilt. My friends and I thought that it would be a fantastic idea to climb onto the roof and practice our parkour skills. After about 30 minutes, one of my friends stood on a skylight and it gave out from under him. He only just managed to grab onto the ledge, which stopped him from falling in. Myself and my other friend then rushed over and grabbed his hands to start pulling him up when we noticed a little girl standing on a chair directly in the moonlight, looking up and waving. We pulled our friend to safety and quickly looked back over the side to find that the little girl was gone and the chair was on its side. We all left pretty quickly after that. All of us were shocked. We later discovered that that part of the hospital was used to treat burn victims, and a 6-year-old girl had once died there. This is a story that my grandma told me, so it may not be 100% accurate, but I'll try and tell it the best that I can. More than 70 years ago, sorry for not knowing the exact timeline, my great-grandfather died of a heart attack. He was, of course, buried like any other person. Here we have a tradition that every 5 years we lift the remains of the deceased, and the family can decide if they should put the body somewhere else or leave it there. This is mostly due to the empty spaces in the graveyard if the deceased doesn't have any family. So they raised my great-grandfather's remains, but the weird thing was that he had not decomposed. He looked exactly as if he had just been buried. After 5 more years had passed, they went to lift his remains again, but this time, the coffin was empty. This is not how the story ends. 10 years after all this happened, my aunt, that was 8 at the time, was home alone one day, and she heard a strange noise in the house, so she went to investigate. In the kitchen there was a strange man who looked at her and said, "Don't be scared. I just came to see my first granddaughter." And then he disappeared. Later that day she told her parents, and after describing the man, they went to get an old photo album, and she identified my great-granddad. When my grandmother tells this story, she tends to omit the last part that my aunt told me. According to my grandmother, the priest probably sold my great-grandfather's corpse because it wasn't decomposing, and she says that my aunt is lying about having seen him. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled, and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the 3rd patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway. Not entirely my story, but the main event happened to my mom when she lived at home with my grandparents. Back when she was a teen, they had a beagle that would often stare down the hallway and growl at nothing, the whole deal. In the middle of the night while lying in bed, my mom heard the dog begin to growl just before she felt someone grab her by the ankles and begin to yank her out of her bed. She says she was halfway pulled onto the carpet before she started saying the Lord's Prayer and the hands let go of her. But her dog was still going absolutely nuts. There have been other little things that have happened there too involving other people in my family. No one seems immensely worried about it, but I've always had the feeling of being watched in that house, even before knowing some of the stories I've heard now that I'm older. It's always the same one. My grandparents have lived in it since it was built when they were first married, so no bad history of the house itself, but perhaps the land that it's on? My grandma has told us stories about seeing shadow figures walking down the hall. My brother smelled my grandpa's cigar smoke in the kitchen during a family event. My grandpa had passed away a couple of years ago. Used to always smoke a certain brand of cigar outside on the back porch. And I once was startled by a loud, raspy cough right behind me while I sat in the empty house playing computer games with the speakers off. Recently, my mom and I had installed some cameras in the basement and on the front and back porches, just for extra security. I'm dreading the day my grandma tells us one of them caught something, and I'll have to see it with my own eyes. This experience left me pretty shaken up for a while. To begin, I was a fairly depressed and antisocial 15-year-old in high school, and on weekends I'd go and stay with my older sister in her apartment to get away from my parents and finally just relax. During this time, I'd gotten into studying astral projection, and I'd always been interested in the paranormal, as my mom and I had experienced things in our house, and my mom claimed that she could see the spirits. Anyway, one day after some reading, I decided to take the bus over to Toys R Us, where they still to this day sell Ouija boards to kids. I bought one of the silly glow-in-the-dark ones. My sister and I were really excited to start using it. Within a few minutes of putting our hands on the planchette, it began moving in a circle. Our first introduction was a little girl named Sarah. We end up chatting with this little spirit all night. Then, it turns into every single weekend. We begin to feel almost addicted to the board, always going to chat with Sarah. It was a long time ago, but I remember her saying that she was from the 1800s. She'd be so excited to talk every time we showed up. The planchette would spin in circles all over the board. We could even take our hands off of it, and it would continue to move. The addiction to the board goes on for months. Finally, one day we decide to ask Sarah to physically show us that she exists. We ask for a sign, and a strong breeze shoots straight into my ear so hard that I jumped back from the board. There was no AC on, no windows open, and no fans in the room. From here on, things get odd, and Sarah says that she is attached to me. I started getting an off feeling, and I ask, "Are you really Sarah, or are you someone else?" Some of the things you say are pretty adult for a young girl." Then the planchette began to playfully spin all over the place, ending on "no." I feel a sense of almost maniacal laughter in the air. It's hard to explain, but my sister feels it too. Turns out Sarah was actually a man named Solomon. Solomon said that he loved me and that he was going to follow me. From there we were freaked out and decided to stop using the board, but the pull was strong and it legitimately feels as if it were an addiction. After this incident, I can almost always feel someone watching me when I'm alone. I'd see the shape of a man in my head and the dark windows at night, but just for a second, enough to make me think I was losing my mind. I was frequently exploring church with my sister and was so scared from seeing figures pass by the windows and from feeling someone standing behind me that I told the preacher about our Ouija board use. He said he would pray and that I would have to ignore the spirit. Not the greatest advice. A month later, I had an odd and terrifying dream. Suddenly I'm above my body and in the den in my parents' house where I'd fallen asleep on the couch late at night. I look down at myself and then feel a presence by my body's head behind the couch near the hallway. There is a man standing there. He's wearing a black leather jacket, fitted, vintage-looking jeans, dark boots, kind of 40s, 50s-ish biker style. He was probably in his mid-20s. He had pale skin, dark, short-cut hair, and totally black eyes. He's almost attractive, if he weren't terrifying. He smiles at me eerily, and at light speed, jumps for my body. I panic and jump too, trying to get back into my body before he does. I wake up in a panic, sweating and shaking. Somehow, I eventually fall asleep at first light. And then when I awaken in the late afternoon, my mom tells me that she woke up to use the bathroom at night and fell to the ground in the living room having a seizure. I didn't know what to do or say. I was shocked. Could it have been from the paranormal encounter? Because she's a sensitive too? She used antidepressants frequently and switched them around a lot. But what a strange coincidence for it to happen that night. After that incident, life just continued on. So much of my teenage life felt negative at that age already that I just kept trekking forward, feeling someone behind me on some days not. The energy in my family's home was generally bad. Parents fighting constantly, father using drugs, mom in different phases of her bipolar. Definitely some energy a bad spirit or two could feed on. Fast forward to sophomore year in high school. I used to sit in the corner in band doing homework quietly, and one day a girl known as the school witch comes up to me. We'd maybe talked a few times, but didn't know each other very well. She simply states, "So there's a man following you, a spirit. I'm going to do a spell for you tonight to make him leave." Once again shocked, I tell her that there has been someone following me. She nods like, yes, obviously, then walks away before I can say anything else. By junior year, I'm dating a boy who lost his brother to suicide only months before we'd met. One night he calls in a panic and states that he was brutally attacked by a male spirit or demon in a dreamlike yet awake state. He said he felt someone sitting on him and could see a black spirit in the room. He called his brother's spirit to save him. He claims he felt a whoosh of energy and that his brother pushed the spirit off of his chest. He woke up really scared, saying that he'd never felt anything like it and that he'd never had negative spirit encounters before except as a small child. What scares me is that he'd randomly have episodes after this that made him not in his right mind or almost mad. At the time, I'd felt and seen his brother's spirit twice, and it was never a hostile feeling. I felt somewhat protected while dating him because of this, but Solomon's negative spirit was something I still worried about and felt on occasion. Years go by, and I eventually become best friends with a girl whose family ghost hunts. We ghost hunt together, experience some creepy stuff, and I become less fearful. 2 years into our relationship, I get the courage to tell her psychic aunt my story, and she seeks to find out more about this spirit. She connects with him and laughs some. He's 5150, hun. He's absolutely mad. He's not necessarily evil, but he attached himself to you because he likes how easily he can scare you. He doesn't necessarily want to hurt you, but your fear gives him pleasure. In life, it seems, he was quite mentally ill. I was absolutely stunned. It all made so much sense, and how would she know this? After the talk, my best friend and her aunt tell him to F off, and to imagine a white light and to let him know he's not welcome. This seems forward, but one night I feel the presence and it angers me. Years of someone just wanting to scare me. I yell at the empty room that I'm not afraid of him and that he's not welcome. I use sage, imagine white light, and yell for him to leave. I feel a stir in the energy, almost like he's not even that angry to leave. It felt more like an annoyance at losing his fear target. From that point on, I've had the upper hand. There was one more experience with him one day at 25 while in a toxic living situation. This was 6 years after the experience with my friend's aunt. I left my body again and was excited. Finally, astral projecting as an adult. I sit up, and lo and behold, there he is, standing by the bed. But this time I shoot white light at him. He's gone in an instant. Then my toxic roommate at the time walks through the wall to grab me. I wake up. Was he trying to warn me? Does he still visit me? Can I ever make him leave for good? Sometimes I wonder if he ever felt compassion for me. It was all so strange, and I frequently meditate and banish negative spirits or energy from around me. I've shut down a lot spiritually because of these incidents. I constantly state that nothing is allowed to bother me, but I wonder if somehow he'll be there forever. It worries me sometimes, especially because he'd stated on the board that he didn't want anyone to have me. I feel confident that spiritually I am strong, but I've always wondered if there was some deeper level of banishing that I could have, or should have done, or could still do. Anyway, I wanted to share this story because it's been both such a weight and a mystery to me for so many years. I don't know what I believe anymore. Sometimes I wonder if my extremely negative state of mind drew him to my depressed teenage self. Maybe somehow I created this negative entity? I doubt that one, but it is still possible. I feel in a much better place mentally, physically, and spiritually now, so I don't feel threatened by spirits, or really believe that he is around anymore. But who knows? I sage and cleanse my place almost daily and feel it to be a safe and light space. I will say that there is still so much I don't know when it comes to all of those incidents. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost, a dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong. I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time, we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours, dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky, when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes, and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs, and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night, and when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't? I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or two I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I log them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately, I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, You have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help. I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radioed my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company, and they had no one by that name, and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy, and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. When I was young, my family was digging up the backyard about a meter deep, and I found an old, rusty skeleton key. Me being a kid, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. It became my favorite toy. Most days I'd play with my Legos, Action Mans, and now my new key in my room. And this is when it started happening. I would have my bedroom door closed, and it would suddenly just open by itself and swing wide, slowly. This went on for months, and I didn't think anything about it really until I asked my mom why she kept opening my door, and she said that she hadn't. So the next time I was playing, I watched the door as it opened and yelled at it to go away. The door slammed shut, and my mom came running from the other side of the house to see what was going on. Fast forward to now, and I've started being able to see them. You know how you look at a light, and you get those wriggly things and spots in your eye? They appear like that, like an implant on my mind, except when you look around, they don't stay on that position on your eye. They stay on that position in space. I've gotten to the point where I don't need to verbally say anything to get rid of them. I just think about a way of getting rid of them, and they disintegrate or disappear. There are some, though, that are more powerful than others and take more effort. I just got finished getting rid of one at my girlfriend's house, and it was probably the hardest one yet. I had to picture the sun swallowing it whole, and watched as a miniature sun appeared in the room next to it and swallowed it as it was screaming. I've never heard sounds from them before, which is part of the reason I'm writing this. I've never told anyone about this. I don't think I'm crazy. I have a pretty normal life. I've never had any mental illnesses, and there's no history of any in my family. I'm wondering if there's anyone else out there seeing these things the same way I do. I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch, and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by. The door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement, anywhere that I went had a resident complaining of water running all night. A number of years ago, my mother and I were visiting my aunt in Idaho, staying in her odd house. She had always told us it was haunted, but I never really believed her because to her, everything was haunted. Well, one night during our stay, my mom woke up hearing a baby cry. My cousin Julie, her husband Matt, 10-year-old son Joe, and her daughter Cindy, who was just a few months old, were living with her at the time. My mom assumed that it was their infant daughter and asked my cousin about the crying in the middle of the night, saying something like, "I don't assume you got much sleep." Julie responded by telling her that the noise that she had heard had not been Cindy. But I had heard it right outside my door as well. She then said it must have been her son playing some sort of prank, to which Joe quickly rebutted her by saying that it was not him. Joe also said that he wasn't going back to that part of the house at night. We believed Joe, as his mother and my cousin had experienced things back there several times. He's now an adult and married, and still maintains his innocence, as well as refusing to ever stay in that house alone. Fast forward to last summer. I took a few days vacation and flew up to join my mom and see the family. One night, my aunt, mom, myself, and Joe's wife were sitting at the bar that separates her kitchen from the living room. All of a sudden, in the back of the house, we heard the sound of a door closing. I looked up to see if anyone else had heard it. They had. We got up to investigate the sound, thinking that someone else was in the house. There was not a soul to be found. Then we began to investigate what could have caused it. It sounded like a heavy metal door. We came to the conclusion that it could have been someone hit the loose bathroom door handle. The bathroom was in my line of sight, with no one else in the house at the time. The place just feels weird. It always has. There are many more stories in that house that I've heard about, but I know that I won't do them justice. At first, I thought she was on drugs, but then she did something that made me wonder if she was telling the truth. I was 16. A friend and I were walking through a local park at night when we saw this Asian woman wearing what looked like a traditional Chinese dress. She was dancing alone in the grass, and she then started running toward us, scared the crap out of me, and began telling us how handsome that we were. This woman appeared to be in her mid to late 20s, and honestly, she was stunningly beautiful. She kept telling us that she was a vampire, and that she was centuries old. I was thinking, okay, she's obviously on something or she's crazy. But then she gazes into my eyes and says, "Do you want to feel my energy?" I said sure, and she then placed her hand a few inches from my face. The amount of energy or whatever it was that came from her hand caused my entire skull to vibrate and made me extremely dizzy. I have no idea what that could have been. I have never seen her again to this day, but I often think about it. I'm 23 now. I tried researching Asian myths and legends, trying to discover some kind of spirit or demon common to a specific culture that resembles her. Could anyone tell me what this apparition was, or if she was just a crazy woman with psychic abilities? Okay, so this has happened 2 times that we noticed. The first time was 3 months ago. At 2 a.m., my husband was playing an Xbox game. Name of the game was Halo. So it was only my husband. My kids were asleep upstairs, and I was down in the basement in our room in bed. I was reading. He told me that he was on the couch. The game was paused since he was looking in his phone for a cheat or something for it. By the stairs, he clearly heard, "Mommy." My daughter doesn't call me like this, but they were asleep. He even checked. This was yesterday. At 5 p.m., I was coloring in the living room. The TV was on a Parking Wars episode, and my kids were upstairs playing a game. The hubby was outside mowing the yard. I clearly heard, "Mommy? Mommy, Mommy!" Clearly a little girl, and it sounded like it was behind me, not where my kids would be. And it was not my daughter's voice. Now today, I was folding clothes and had small hand towels by me. I watched as they were pushed off of the couch and away from me. Not like they would if they had just fallen down. It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen, and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape, dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit, got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day, I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working. I am a security officer, and I work in a low-volume hospital. I'm sitting in my office on the computer, and to the left of me is a closet door about 3 feet away. It's a small office. Out of nowhere, there are 2 very loud pounding sounds coming from inside the closet. These were full-on banging sounds, not just knocks. It shook the entire office, it was so violent. I jumped what felt like 10 feet out of my chair. It took me a minute to realize what had just happened before I actually looked inside. Of course, nothing was in there, just some old office equipment. I'm kind of in shock now. I've worked here for a year, and have had some odd stuff happen, but I could always find an explanation in my head. This time, I just can't. We've had reports of odd things happening from the housekeeping and other workers. This just happened about 30 minutes ago. I was in the kitchen, and as I turned around, the very strong scent of my mom's distinct perfume hit me in the face. This happened 3 times. Now, my mother had an unusual mix of perfumes she used to wear, and was known to wear a lot of it. Also, she had a hint of air fresheners that she also had a lot of in her house. Mom passed away over 2 years ago and had never been to this house. We've only lived here 18 months. And we don't have anything here that smells the same as that. It was so strong and so distinct that my heart immediately pounded, and I shouted to my partner, "I can smell my mother." I thought I saw something climb the stairs earlier today too, but passed it off as my eyes playing tricks on me. Now I think there may be more to it. Many years ago, I visited a secret bunker in England that had been turned into a museum. The only thing I knew about it beforehand was that it had been built during the Second World War. The atmosphere inside was kinda creepy because it was underground and very quiet, and there were mannequins dotted about the place, but that didn't really bother me. What creeped me out the most was a feeling of being watched and followed by someone or something that I couldn't see. During one part of the tour, I was leaving one of the rooms when a desk lamp suddenly turned itself off. I was the only person in the room at the time, and the lamp was behind glass, so nobody could get to it to switch it off. When I got home, I did some research on the bunker and found out that TV's Most Haunted had done an investigation there once, and they felt exactly the same feelings of being watched and followed as I had. I'm a bit skeptical about ghosts, so I can't say for certain if my experience was paranormal or not, but it was certainly quite interesting. I woke up in bed, and next to me I could see a man lying there with no distinctive facial features except for brown, darkish hair. He got up and moved to the side of my hospital bed and sat in front of me. He said to me, "You're going to die soon." I asked when, but he didn't respond, and I got up and locked myself in the bathroom. I've still never figured out what they meant, or who they were. I wasn't on any medication that would bring on any hallucinations or anything like this, but this has not happened before or since.